The valley sits in the mountains of northwestern Vietnam like a wound that never healed, 12 kilometers long, 8 kilometers wide, surrounded by jungle-covered ridges that rise nearly 2,000 feet above the valley floor. The Red River traces a path through the center, its waters brown with silt during the monsoon season, and on either side of it, the rice paddies stretch in geometric patterns that speak to centuries of cultivation. The Thai people who lived here before the war called it Muang Than, the land of the heavenly kingdom, but by March of 1954, it had become something else entirely. It had become the place where the French Empire would come to die. Operation Castor had begun 5 months earlier, in November 1953, when French paratroopers dropped into the valley with orders to establish a fortified base that would draw the Viet Minh into a set-piece battle, the kind of conventional engagement where French artillery and air support would prove decisive. The architect of this strategy was Colonel Christian de Castries, an aristocratic cavalry officer who wore a red cap and silk scarf even in the field, a man whose confidence in European military superiority was absolute. He named his strong points after his mistresses: Gabrielle, Beatrice, Anne-Marie, Isabelle, Claudine, Dominique, Eliane, Huguette. 8 fortified positions scattered across the valley floor, connected by trenches and barbed wire, manned by 16,000 French Union troops, French Foreign Legionnaires, Moroccan tirailleurs, Vietnamese paratroopers, Thai auxiliaries, and Algerian riflemen. The heat during the day was brutal, temperatures climbing above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the humidity so thick it felt like breathing through wet cloth. At night, the temperature dropped into the 60s, and the fog rolled down from the mountains, settling over the valley in layers so dense that sentries couldn't see more than 10 meters beyond their positions. The rain came in sheets during the monsoon, turning the red clay soil into mud that sucked at boots and bogged down vehicles, flooding the trenches until they became rivers, collapsing dugouts and drowning supplies. The men lived in bunkers reinforced with logs and sandbags, cooking over small fires, sleeping in shifts, listening to the sound of rain on canvas and the distant thump of artillery that never quite stopped. But the valley had a history that preceded the French, a history that lived in the memories of the Thai and Hmong villagers who had fled to the hills when the soldiers arrived. They spoke of Phi, spirits of the dead who lingered in places where violence had occurred, where the earth had been soaked with blood and the proper rituals had not been performed. The valley had seen centuries of warfare, conflicts between hill tribes, between Vietnamese kingdoms, between the Chinese and the Vietnamese, between the Thai and the Viet. The bones were in the soil, layered like geological strata, and the villagers believed that disturbing the ground, digging trenches and bunkers and artillery pits was an invitation for the spirits to rise. The French paid no attention to these warnings. They were engineers of empire, believers in reason and firepower, and they approached Dien Bien Phu as a logistical problem to be solved through superior technology and military doctrine. They flew in artillery pieces, 105mm and 155mm howitzers, dismantled and reassembled them on the valley floor. They built an airstrip capable of handling transport planes, though it would come under constant artillery fire once the Viet Minh arrived. They established supply dumps, command bunkers, field hospitals, and a network of defensive positions that on paper looked impregnable. General Von Nguyen Giap thought otherwise. He was the architect of Viet Minh strategy, a former history teacher who had studied Napoleon and the tactics of revolutionary warfare, and he recognized Dien Bien Phu for what it was, a trap, but not for the Viet Minh, for the French. Giap mobilized 50,000 troops, moving them through the jungle on bicycles and on foot, carrying artillery pieces up mountain trails that French intelligence had deemed impassable. He positioned his guns on the ridges overlooking the valley, concealing them in caves and reinforced bunkers, and he waited. He waited for the monsoon to close the valley in, for the fog to ground the French aircraft, for the mud to turn the airstrip into a quagmire. And when the moment came, he would unleash a bombardment that would turn the valley into a hell from which there would be no escape. The first shells fell on Beatrice on the evening of March 13. Not the harassing fire the French had grown accustomed to, but a sustained barrage that lasted 6 hours and reduced the strong point to rubble. The bunkers collapsed. The communication lines were severed. The legionnaires fought hand to hand in the darkness, but by dawn Beatrice had fallen, and with it died the illusion that French artillery superiority would determine the outcome of the battle. Giap's guns outnumbered theirs, were better positioned, and were served by crews who had been trained to fire and displace before French counter-battery fire could locate them. On March 14th, Gabriel fell. On March 17th, Anne-Marie was abandoned by its Thai defenders, who melted into the jungle rather than face certain death. The perimeter began to contract. The airstrip came under direct fire, making resupply increasingly difficult, and the wounded began to pile up in the field hospital faster than the surgeons could treat them. The smell of gangrene and sepsis mixed with the smell of cordite and wet earth, and the men in the trenches, who had been told this would be a brief engagement, began to understand that they were not going to leave the valley alive. But it was not the artillery that broke them first. It was something else, something that started as a rumor in the 3rd Company of the 1st Foreign Parachute Battalion, a unit holding a section of trench near Strong Point Eliane. The men spoke in low voices, glancing over their shoulders, unwilling to repeat what they had heard, except to those they trusted. They said there was a soldier in the trenches who would not stop crying. Not weeping from fear or exhaustion, which was common enough, but crying with a sound that was wrong, inhuman, a keening wail that rose and fell like a siren and could be heard even over the artillery. They said he appeared at night, always alone, always in sections of trench where men had died, and that anyone who saw him, anyone who looked directly into his face, would be dead within 24 hours. The officers dismissed it as combat fatigue, as the kind of story men told themselves to explain the randomness of death in a siege where shells fell without warning and snipers killed from positions no one could locate. But the stories persisted, and as the days wore on, as the perimeter continued to shrink and the casualty lists grew longer, more men began to report seeing him. A figure in a French uniform, standing in the fog, his face turned away, his shoulders shaking with sobs that sounded like something dying. On the night of March 20th, a Moroccan sergeant named Hassan Bouaza saw the crying soldier standing at the end of a communication trench near Dominique. He called out, asking for identification, and the figure turned toward him. Bouaza never described what he saw, not to his commanding officer, not to the medics who found him the next morning sitting in the mud, staring at nothing, his rifle lying beside him unfired. He died 3 hours later, his heart simply stopping, no wounds, no apparent cause. The medics wrote it up as cardiac arrest brought on by stress and malnutrition, but the men who had served with Bouaza knew better. They had heard the crying the night before. They had felt the cold that came with it, even in the humid heat of the monsoon. And they knew, with a certainty that transcended reason, that something was hunting in the trenches of Dien Bien Phu, something that wore the uniform of the dead and wept for reasons no living man could understand. By the 3rd week of March, the situation inside Dien Bien Phu had deteriorated beyond anything the planners in Hanoi or Paris had anticipated. The perimeter had contracted to less than half its original size. The airstrip was unusable, except during brief windows when Viet Minh artillery paused, and even then, transport pilots had to make combat landings through walls of anti-aircraft fire that brought down 1 in every 3 aircraft attempting to land. Resupply came almost exclusively by parachute drop now, and half of those supplies landed outside French lines, falling into Viet Minh hands or lost in the mud and craters that covered the valley floor. The hospital bunker beneath Strongpoint Elian had become a charnel house. 400 wounded men lay in a space designed for 80, their bodies packed so tightly that surgeons had to step over patients to reach the operating tables. The air was thick with the smell of blood, excrement, and the sweet, sick odor of infected tissue. Major Paul Grauwin, the chief surgeon, worked 18-hour shifts under the light of kerosene lamps, amputating limbs without anesthetic when the morphine ran out, triaging men into categories that had no official names but which everyone understood. Those who might survive, those who would die slowly, and those who needed to be made comfortable while they died quickly. The sound in the hospital was constant: moaning, screaming, prayers in a dozen languages, and the wet rasp of men drowning in their own blood from sucking chest wounds. Above ground, in the trenches and bunkers that ringed the remaining strong points, the men existed in a state between exhaustion and hypervigilance that military psychiatrists would later identify as acute combat stress reaction. They hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in weeks. They were filthy, their uniforms rotting off their bodies, their skin covered in jungle sores and infected insect bites. They ate cold rations when rations were available, drank rainwater collected in shell craters, and defecated in sections of trench that were designated for that purpose, but which could not be properly maintained because any movement above ground during daylight drew immediate sniper fire. The French command structure was fragmenting. Colonel de Castries had retreated to his command bunker and rarely emerged, leaving tactical decisions to his subordinates. Major Marcel Bigard, who commanded the 6th Colonial Parachute Battalion, had become the de facto leader of the defense, a scarred veteran of the Second World War who moved through the trenches with a walking stick and a hunting knife, rallying his men through sheer force of personality. But even Bigard could not hold back the inevitable. The Viet Minh were digging approach trenches, advancing meter by meter, close enough now that French sentries could hear them working at night, could hear the sound of shovels biting into earth, and the murmur of voices in Vietnamese. It was in this environment, during the 4th week of March, that Lieutenant Jean-Claude Murat was given an assignment that would haunt him for the rest of his brief life. Murat was 23 years old, a graduate of Saint-Cyr Military Academy, and he had been at Dien Bien Phu since the beginning. He commanded a platoon of the 1st Foreign Legion Parachute Regiment, 32 men at the start of the siege, now reduced to 14. They held a section of trench connecting strong points Dominique and Elian, a zigzag line of mud-filled ditches reinforced with sandbags and logs, stretching roughly 200 meters across terrain that offered no cover and was under constant observation by Viet Minh artillery spotters on the hills above. The assignment came from Major Bigard himself. 3 soldiers had gone missing over the past 48 hours. Not killed, not captured, but simply gone. They had been on sentry duty, posted at intervals along the trench line, and when the relief watch arrived, the positions were empty. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. Just empty positions and rifles left leaning against the trench wall, as if the men had set them down and walked away into the night. This was unacceptable. Desertion was one thing, but desertion without a trace suggested either Viet Minh infiltration or something worse. A breakdown in unit cohesion that could spread like a disease if not addressed immediately. Bigard wanted answers. He told Murat to take a fire team and conduct a sweep of the trench line between Dominique and Elian to question the sentries, to look for any sign of the missing men, and to restore confidence among the troops who were starting to whisper about things that had nothing to do with the enemy they could see. Murat knew what those whispers were about. He had heard them himself. The crying soldier, the figure that appeared in the fog, the cold that came with it, and the deaths that followed. He didn't believe in ghosts, or at least he told himself he didn't, but he also couldn't explain what was happening. And in the absence of explanation, belief became irrelevant. What mattered was that his men were scared, and scared men made mistakes, and mistakes in a siege got people killed. He assembled his team at 2200 hours on March 23rd. 4 men, all veterans, all exhausted but still functional. Corporal André Petit, a legionnaire from Marseille who had survived Indochina campaigns that predated Dien Bien Phu. Private First Class Klaus Richter, a German who had joined the Legion after the war because he had nowhere else to go. Private Nguyen Van Thieu, a Vietnamese paratrooper who served as translator and who understood the local beliefs about spirits in ways the French did not. And Private Marcel Dubois, a kid from Lyon who had been in country for 4 months and who still had the wide-eyed look of someone who hadn't yet accepted that he was going to die here. They moved out at 22:15 hours, carrying their MAT-49 submachine guns and grenades, wearing their helmets and flak vests, even though both offered minimal protection against the kind of artillery the Viet Minh were using. The trench was knee-deep in water in some sections, the mud sucking at their boots with every step. The walls were collapsing in places, held together by sandbags that had been shredded by shrapnel and by logs that had been splintered by direct hits. Overhead, the sky was overcast, the moon hidden behind clouds, and the only light came from flares fired periodically by both sides, brief moments of magnesium-white illumination that turned the valley into a landscape of stark shadows and revealed nothing useful. They reached the first sentry post at 22:30 hours. The position was empty. The soldier who should have been there, a Moroccan rifleman named Aziz, was nowhere to be seen. His rifle was there, his pack was there, even his helmet was there, sitting on the firing step as if he had just removed it to wipe the sweat from his forehead. But Aziz himself was gone. Murat questioned the soldiers in the adjacent positions, but no one had seen anything, no one had heard anything. One of them said he thought he had heard crying around 2100 hours, but it had been faint, distant, and he had assumed it was coming from the hospital bunker, where wounded men cried all the time. They moved to the second position. Empty again. Same story. Rifle, pack, helmet, but no soldier. The man's name had been Leroux, a legionnaire from Toulouse, and according to the duty roster, he had been on watch since 2000 hours. Murat checked his watch. It was now 22:45 hours. Leroux had been gone for at least 45 minutes, possibly longer, and no one had noticed because in the chaos of the siege, in the constant noise of artillery and small arms fire, one absent sentry could go unnoticed until the relief watch arrived. Private Nguyen spoke up, his voice low and careful, as if he was afraid of being overheard by something other than the other men in the team. He said the local people, the Thai and Hmong, believed that when many died in one place without proper burial, the spirits of the dead became confused, unable to find their way to the afterlife. These spirits would wander, searching for something they had lost, their bodies, their names, their purpose. And sometimes they would cry, not from sadness but from rage, because they had been abandoned, because no one had performed the rites that would release them. Corporal Petit told Nguyen to shut up, that they didn't have time for ghost stories, but Murat could see that the others were listening, that even Petit, hardened as he was, didn't dismiss it entirely. Because they had all heard the crying, they had all felt the cold, and they were all aware on some level that bypassed rational thought that the valley was full of the dead, hundreds, maybe thousands, buried in shallow graves or left unburied altogether, their bodies rotting in the mud and the monsoon rain. At 2300 hours, they reached a section of trench that had been hit by a direct artillery strike 2 days earlier. The walls had collapsed completely, creating a gap in the line that was covered only by a listening post. A single soldier positioned in a shell crater with orders to report any enemy movement. The soldier who should have been there was named Fontaine, and like the others, he was gone. But unlike the others, there was blood. Not a lot, just a smear on the edge of the crater, dark and still wet, and a trail of it leading down into the crater itself, as if something had been dragged. Murat climbed down into the crater, his weapon raised, and found Fontaine at the bottom, He was sitting with his back against the mud wall, his eyes open, his mouth open, his face frozen in an expression that Murat would later describe as absolute terror. There was no visible wound. The blood on the edge of the crater had not come from him. Murat checked for a pulse and found none. The body was cold, far colder than it should have been given that Fontaine had been alive less than an hour ago. The skin was gray, almost blue, and when Murat touched it, frost cracked under his fingers. From somewhere in the darkness, close enough that it could not have been more than 20 meters away, came the sound of crying. Not the crying of a wounded man, not the crying of someone in pain, but something else. A wail that rose and fell with mechanical precision, toneless and inhuman, like a siren made of grief. Corporal Petit whispered, his voice tight. "We need to leave. Now." Murat agreed. They climbed out of the crater, formed up, and began moving back toward the command post. Faster now, not quite running, but close to it. And as they moved, the crying followed them, staying always just out of sight, always just beyond the edge of the light from the flares, a presence that was watching, waiting and weeping for reasons no one could understand. Lieutenant Murat filed his report at 0130 hours on March 24th, sitting in a bunker lit by a single kerosene lamp that cast shadows across maps marked with the contracting perimeter of French positions. Major Bigard read it in silence, his face revealing nothing, though his hands gripped the edge of the field table hard enough that his knuckles went white. 4 men missing. 1 found dead with no apparent cause. Blood that didn't belong to the victim, and a sound that 5 trained soldiers had heard and could not explain. Bigard asked Murat if he believed the men were dealing with Viet Minh infiltrators using psychological warfare tactics, recordings perhaps, or speakers hidden in the trenches to demoralize the defenders. Murat said he didn't think so. The sound moved. It followed them. And the cold that came with it was real, measurable, not something that could be faked with equipment. Bigard asked if Murat thought his men were hallucinating, suffering from combat fatigue or malaria-induced fever. Murat said he had considered that, but all 5 of them had heard it, had felt it, and Fontaine's body had been objectively cold, cold enough that frost had formed on his skin in 90-degree heat. Bigard dismissed him without further comment, but before Murat left, the major said something that stayed with him. He said that Dien Bien Phu was not the first time the French had fought in a place where the dead outnumbered the living, and it wouldn't be the last. He said there were reports from other colonial wars, from Madagascar in 1947, from Algeria in the years after, from Indochina itself in battles that predated this siege, of phenomena that did not fit within the framework of conventional military analysis. Men who disappeared, men who died without wounds, and always the sense of being watched by something that existed just outside the range of human perception. He told Murat to keep his men together, to avoid isolated positions when possible, and to report any further incidents directly to him. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that Private Nguyen might know more about this than the rest of them, and that it might be worth listening to what he had to say, even if it sounded like superstition. Murat returned to his platoon's section of trench and found his men gathered in a dugout, smoking cigarettes and speaking in low voices. Private Nguyen was telling them about Phi Tai Hong, the spirits of those who died violent deaths. He said these spirits were angry, trapped between worlds, and they sought to drag the living into death with them because they could not bear to be alone in the darkness. The French custom of burying soldiers in marked graves with crosses and ceremonies was meant to give the dead peace. But here, in this valley, there had been no time for proper burials. The bodies were thrown into mass graves or left where they fell, and the artillery had churned the earth so thoroughly that even those graves had been opened, the bodies exposed again to the elements, denied rest. Corporal Petit interrupted, asking what they were supposed to do about it. Nguyen said the traditional protection was salt, incense, and prayers, but those things required preparation, required ritual knowledge that soldiers didn't have. There was another way, though. The spirits hunted at night, in darkness, in places where the living did not gather in numbers. They avoided fire, avoided noise, avoided anything that affirmed life and community. So the best defense was to stay together, to keep fires burning when possible, and to never, under any circumstances, look directly at the crying soldier if they encountered him. Because to see his face was to acknowledge him, and to acknowledge him was to invite his attention. Private Dubois, the young soldier from Dien, asked what the face looked like. Nguyen said he didn't know, because everyone who had seen it was dead. But the stories from the villages said it was not a face at all, not in the way the living understood faces. It was an absence, a hole where a face should be, and looking into it was like looking into the moment of your own death. The men sat in silence after that, smoking and watching the entrance to the dugout as if something might appear there at any moment. Murat wanted to tell them it was nonsense, that they were rational men living in the 20th century, and that ghosts did not exist outside of peasant folklore. But he couldn't, because he had felt it himself. The cold, the presence, the certainty that something was watching them from the darkness. And he had seen Fontaine's body, had touched the frost on dead skin, and no rational explanation could account for that. Over the next 48 hours, the reports multiplied. A sentry on Strong Point Claudine reported seeing a figure standing in no man's land, motionless during a lull in the artillery fire. He called out a challenge, received no response, and fired a warning shot. The figure didn't move. He fired again, center mass, and the figure vanished. Not fell, not retreated, but vanished as if it had never been there. 20 minutes later, the sentry collapsed at his post. The medics found him hypothermic, his core temperature at 92 degrees, babbling about eyes that weren't eyes and a voice that spoke his name. A Moroccan machine gun crew on Ilian reported that their position had gone cold during the night, cold enough that their breath fogged and condensation formed on the barrel of their weapon. The cold lasted 7 minutes, then dissipated as suddenly as it had appeared. One member of the crew, a corporal named Idris, said he had seen a soldier standing at the far end of their trench during those 7 minutes, his back turned, his shoulders shaking as if sobbing. Idris had not approached him, had not called out because something in his bones told him that to do so would be fatal. The next morning, another member of the crew was found dead in his sleeping position. No wounds, no explanation. The pattern was becoming clear to those who were willing to see it. The crying soldier appeared in sections of trench where men had died. He appeared at night, in darkness or fog. And those who encountered him, especially those who looked at him directly or attempted to engage with him, died within hours, their bodies exhibiting signs of extreme hypothermia despite the tropical heat. Major Grauwen, the chief surgeon, examined 3 of the bodies and found identical pathology: cellular damage consistent with flash freezing, ice crystal formation in the tissues, and cardiac arrest brought on by catastrophic hypothermia. But the ambient temperature records showed no drop, no environmental explanation. He documented his findings in his medical log, noting that if he had not seen the bodies himself, he would have assumed the reports were fabricated. He recommended that all personnel avoid isolated positions after dark, and that sentries be posted in pairs rather than alone. It was the only practical advice he could offer, because medicine had no answers for this. On the night of March 26th, Lieutenant Murat was ordered to lead a night patrol into no man's land to gather intelligence on Viet Minh trench positions. It was a standard reconnaissance mission, the kind that was conducted every few nights to maintain situational awareness and to demonstrate that the French were still capable of offensive action despite the siege. Murat selected 10 men, including Corporal Petit and Private Nguyen, and they prepared to move out at 0200 hours, during the period when Viet Minh activity was typically at its lowest. They blacked their faces with mud, taped down anything that might rattle, and checked their weapons one final time. The plan was simple: move east along a covered approach, observe the enemy trenches from a distance of 50 meters, note any changes in fortifications or troop concentrations, then withdraw before dawn. Estimated time in no man's land, 90 minutes. They crossed the wire at 02:05 hours and moved into the darkness beyond the perimeter. The ground was cratered and uneven, the mud sucking at their boots, the smell of cordite and decay thick in the air. They moved slowly, maintaining visual contact with each other, listening for any sound that might indicate enemy presence. The artillery had gone quiet, one of those inexplicable lulls that occurred periodically during the siege, and in the absence of explosions, the night was filled with smaller sounds. The drip of water, the rustle of rats moving through the debris, and from somewhere ahead, faint but unmistakable, the sound of crying. Murat held up his hand, signaling a halt. The patrol froze, weapons raised, every man listening. The crying was closer than it should have been, maybe 30 meters ahead, and it was moving laterally across their line of advance. Murat considered aborting the mission, pulling back to friendly lines, but they were already committed, already exposed, in the middle of no man's land, where pulling back was as dangerous as moving forward. He signaled the patrol to move right, to circle around the source of the sound and avoid direct contact. They adjusted their course and continued, but the crying adjusted too, paralleling their movement, staying always just ahead of them. It was hurting them, Murat realized, pushing them towards something or away from something with the same deliberate intent that a hunter uses to drive prey toward a kill zone. He stopped the patrol again, this time waving them into a shell crater for cover. They huddled there in the mud, their breathing controlled, their eyes scanning the darkness. And then Private Nguyen grabbed Murat's arm and pointed. 50 meters away, barely visible in the ambient light from distant flares, was a figure. It stood upright at the edge of a crater, facing away from them, its posture that of a man in uniform. But something about it was wrong. The proportions were off, or the way it stood was off, as if it was not quite subject to gravity in the way living things were. And it was crying. The sound now loud enough to be painful. A wail that seemed to vibrate in Murat's chest cavity and made his teeth ache. Corporal PT whispered, "Don't look at it." We don't look at it, and we move back. Now. But Private Dubois, the young soldier who had been at Dien Bien Phu for only 4 months, and who had never been told the stories that might have saved him, stood up to get a better view. He stared directly at the figure, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, and the figure stopped crying. It turned. Private Dubois screamed. Not words, not a warning, just a raw animal sound of terror that cut through the silence like a blade. He stumbled backward, his weapon falling from his hands, his legs giving out beneath him as he collapsed into the crater. Murat grabbed him by his webbing and pulled him down, covering his mouth with one hand to silence the screaming, but Dubois was beyond reason. His eyes rolled back in his head, his body convulsing with such violence that it took 3 men to hold him still. The figure had turned fully toward them now. Murat didn't look at it directly, Nguyen's warning had been clear enough. But in his peripheral vision, he could see its outline, darker than the surrounding darkness, and he could feel its attention like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. The temperature dropped so suddenly that his breath fogged, and frost began to form on his weapon, on his helmet, on the exposed skin of his hands. The cold was absolute, not the cold of winter, but something deeper, something that reached past the skin and bone and settled in the core of him, making his heart stutter and his thoughts slow. Corporal Petit fired without aiming. A burst from his MAT-49, that cut across the space where the figure stood. The tracer rounds passed through it without effect, sparking off rocks behind it, and the figure didn't flinch, didn't move, just stood there watching them with whatever it used for perception. Private Nguyen was whispering something in Vietnamese, a prayer or a word, his voice rapid and desperate, and the other men in the patrol were backing away, crawling out of the crater, trying to put distance between themselves and the thing that should not exist, but did. Murat made the decision that would save most of them. He ordered a retreat, not a tactical withdrawal, but a full rout, every man for himself, back to the wire, back to the perimeter, running through the darkness with no regard for noise, discipline, or formation. They left Dubois where he lay, still convulsing, still screaming without sound, because to stay would mean death for all of them. It was the calculus of survival, brutal and immediate, and Murat would spend the rest of his short life trying to justify it. They reached the French wire at 02:27 hours, 7 men out of 10, gasping and wild-eyed, their uniforms soaked with mud and sweat despite the cold that still clung to them. The sentries almost shot them before recognizing their own, and it took several minutes of shouted passwords and verification before they were allowed back through the perimeter. Murat immediately reported to Major Bigard, his words tumbling over each other, describing what they had seen and what they had left behind. Bigard listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When Murat finished, the major asked a single question. "Did you look at its face?" "No, sir." Private Nguyen warned us not to. "Good. The men who did?" Dubois looked at it directly. "He's still out there. The other two who didn't make it back, Brossard and Lefebvre, I don't know if they looked or not." Bigard nodded slowly, then walked to the entrance of the bunker and stared out into the darkness toward no man's land. He stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, smoking a cigarette, before turning back to Murat. "I'm not sending anyone to recover them. Not at night. Not for this. At first light, if they're still alive, we'll consider it. Until then, your patrol is confined to this position. No one speaks about what happened out there. Not to the other men, not to the press corps when they ask questions, not to anyone. This stays between us and command. Understood?" "Yes, sir." But it was already too late for that. The men who had been on the patrol were traumatized, shaking, unable to control their breathing, and when other soldiers asked what had happened, they told them. The story spread through the trenches like fire through dry grass. The patrol had encountered the crying soldier, had seen it turn toward them, and 3 men were dead or missing because of it. By dawn, every man in the garrison knew. And with that knowledge came fear, not the manageable fear of enemy fire or artillery bombardment, but something older, something that struck at the core of human psychology. The fear of death that comes without warning, without cause, from something that cannot be fought. At 06:30 hours, a recovery team moved into no man's land, under covering fire from the strong points. They found Brossard and Lefebvre, 200 meters from the French wire, lying face down in the mud. Both were dead, their bodies exhibiting the same signs as the previous victims: extreme hypothermia, ice crystal formation in the tissues, no external wounds. Private Dubois was found in the crater where the patrol had sheltered. He was alive, technically, his heart still beating, but he was catatonic, unresponsive to verbal commands or physical stimuli. His core temperature was 88 degrees Fahrenheit. The medics wrapped him in blankets and carried him to the hospital bunker, but Major Grauwin took one look at him and knew there was nothing medicine could do. Dubois died at 14:20 hours that afternoon, his body simply giving up, his last words spoken in delirium. "Il n'a pas de visage. Il n'a pas de visage." He has no face. The Viet Minh noticed the change in French behavior. Their patrols, which had been probing the French perimeter nightly, reported that the defenders were pulling back from forward positions after dark, consolidating in the main strongpoints, abandoning sections of trench that had been held for weeks. General Giap's intelligence officers speculated that the French were preparing for a breakout attempt, or that morale had finally collapsed to the point where maintaining extended positions was no longer possible. Both assessments were partially correct, but they missed the real reason. The French were terrified of something that had nothing to do with the Viet Minh. On the night of March 27, the crying soldier appeared inside the perimeter for the first time. A sentry on Strong Point Dominique reported a figure standing in the communication trench, motionless, facing away from him. The sentry called for the sergeant of the guard, who arrived with 2 other soldiers, and all 3 of them saw it. The figure was wearing a French uniform, but the uniform was wrong. The cut was old-fashioned, dating to the First World War, and it was soaked with mud and blood that looked black in the dim light. The shoulders shook with the rhythm of sobbing, and the sound was so loud, so overwhelming, that one of the soldiers dropped his weapon and covered his ears. The sergeant ordered them not to approach, not to look at it directly, and they backed away slowly, maintaining visual contact with their peripheral vision. The figure didn't move, didn't turn, just stood there weeping as if it had all the time in the world. They withdrew to the main bunker and reported what they had seen, and within the hour, orders came down from Major Bigard. No one was to engage with any unidentified personnel in French uniform. No one was to approach such figures. No one was to look at them directly. If encountered, personnel were to withdraw and report immediately. But the orders couldn't stop what was happening. The crying soldier began to appear in multiple locations simultaneously. On Elian, on Isabel, on Huguette, in trenches and bunkers across the valley. Sometimes there was only one figure, sometimes there were several, all of them in that same antique uniform, all of them facing away, all of them crying with that mechanical, inhuman wail. The soldiers who saw them reported the same phenomena. Sudden drops in temperature, frost forming on metal surfaces, and a feeling of suffocation, as if the air itself was being drawn away. Men began to die in their sleep. They would lie down in their bunkers, exhausted from the day's fighting, and simply not wake up. The medics would find them cold, their skin gray, their expressions peaceful, but their eyes open and staring. 10 men died this way in a single night, then 15, then 20. The casualty rate from the crying soldier was beginning to rival the casualty rate from Viet Minh artillery. Major Grauwin approached Colonel de Castries directly, bypassing the chain of command, and demanded that the garrison be evacuated. He told the colonel that whatever was killing his men was not something that could be treated with medicine, and that if they remained in the valley, the entire force would be dead before the Viet Minh ever had to launch a final assault. De Castries listened in silence, then told Grauwin that evacuation was impossible, that the orders from Hanoi were to hold Dien Bien Phu at all costs, and that the reports of supernatural phenomena would not be included in any official communication to higher command because such reports would be interpreted as evidence of mass hysteria and would result in the relief of the entire command staff. Grauwin left the meeting and returned to the hospital bunker, where he wrote a letter to his wife that would not be delivered until after his death. In it, he described what he had seen and what he believed, that the valley had been a place of death long before the French arrived, that the earth was saturated with the blood of forgotten wars, and that the siege had awakened something that had been sleeping beneath the ground, something that fed on violence and despair and the violation of the boundary between life and death. On March 28th, Private Nguyen approached Lieutenant Murat with a proposal. He said there was a way to protect themselves, but it required materials that were not readily available in a siege: salt, rice wine, and paper inscribed with specific prayers. Murat asked where they were supposed to get these things, and Nguyen said there was a Thai village 3 kilometers north of the valley, abandoned when the siege began, where such items might still be found in the remains of the temple. It would require a patrol outside the perimeter, a dangerous operation with no guarantee of success, but it was the only option he could think of. Murat took the proposal to Bigard, expecting it to be rejected immediately. Instead, Bigerd approved it. He said that conventional tactics were failing, that men were dying faster than they could be replaced, and that if there was even a chance that Nguyen's folk remedies might help, it was worth the risk. He authorized a patrol of 15 men, to be led by Murat, to depart at 0400 hours on March 29th under cover of darkness. But before they could leave, the crying soldier appeared again, this time in the command bunker itself. Colonel de Castries was meeting with his staff officers, discussing the disposition of forces for the next day's defense, when the temperature in the bunker dropped 30 degrees in less than a minute. The kerosene lamps flickered and went out, and in the darkness they heard it, the sound of weeping coming from the corner of the bunker where no one was standing. One of the officers, a captain named Irvuet, turned on his flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. The beam caught the figure for just a moment, the old uniform, the hunched shoulders, the space where the face should have been but wasn't. Hervuit screamed and dropped the flashlight, and in the moment before the light went out, every man in that bunker saw what Hervuit had seen. Captain Hervuet was dead by midnight. Cardiac arrest. He was 32 years old. Lieutenant Murat's patrol departed at 0355 hours on March 29th, moving north through gaps in the Viet Minh siege lines that intelligence had identified as lightly held. 15 men, including Private Nguyen, who carried a hand-drawn map to the village temple based on his memory of the area before the siege. They moved in complete darkness, no flares, no illumination, using the terrain and the sound of the Red River to navigate. The Viet Minh were close enough to hear. Voices in Vietnamese, the clink of equipment, the sound of digging. But the patrol slipped through unseen, 15 ghosts, moving through a landscape of ghosts. They reached the village at 0520 hours, just as false dawn was beginning to gray the eastern sky. The village was a ruin. Artillery had collapsed most of the structures, and what the shells hadn't destroyed, fire had claimed. The temple stood at the center of what had once been the village square, a small wooden building with a corrugated metal roof that had been partially torn away. The doors hung open, and inside, the Buddha statue had been knocked from its pedestal and lay face down in the debris. Private Nguyen entered first, picking his way through the rubble, searching for anything that might be useful. The others stood guard, watching the approaches, aware that they were exposed, that daylight was coming, and that they had maybe 30 minutes before they needed to be moving back toward French lines. Nguyen found what he was looking for in a wooden chest that had somehow survived intact. Bags of salt, bottles of rice wine wrapped in straw, and stacks of prayer papers covered in Vietnamese script and Chinese characters. He loaded everything into a canvas bag and signaled that they were ready to move. But as they prepared to leave, Corporal Petty pointed toward the tree line north of the village. There was movement there, figures emerging from the jungle, but they weren't Viet Minh. They wore civilian clothes, old men and women, Thai villagers who had fled when the fighting started and who had returned now, drawn by something the patrol couldn't understand. They moved slowly, deliberately, and they were all looking at the temple, at the French soldiers standing in its ruins, with expressions that conveyed not fear, but warning. One of the elders, a woman who might have been 60 or 80, it was impossible to tell, approached to within 10 meters and spoke in Thai. Private Nguyen translated. She says we should not have come here. She says the valley is poisoned, that the dead are walking, and that we are feeding them by staying. Murat asked what she meant by feeding them. Nguyen translated the response. Every death adds to their strength. Every body left unburied gives them form. They were weak before, scattered, but now they are many, and they are becoming solid. She says, if we do not leave the valley soon, none of us will leave at all. The woman said something else, longer this time, and Nguyen's expression changed as he translated. She says her grandson was killed in the valley 2 weeks ago, killed by French shells when he was trying to tend his rice field. She buried him in the traditional way, with all the proper rituals, but last night she saw him standing in the field, and he was crying. She tried to speak to him, but he had no face, just the place where a face should be. And when she came close, the cold nearly killed her. Murat asked if the protections they had gathered, the salt, the wine, the prayers, would work. The woman shook her head when Nguyen translated the question. She said those protections worked against normal spirits, against Phi who were confused or angry, but still retained some connection to their human nature. What walked in Dien Bien Phu now was something else, something that had been created by the magnitude of violence, by the mixing of so much blood from so many nations and soil that had already been soaked with the blood of centuries. The crying soldiers were not individual spirits. They were a collective entity, formed from thousands of deaths, and they were hungry. She said there was only one way to stop them: leave the valley, let the dead have it, let the jungle reclaim it, and perform the rites that would release the spirits, a ceremony that would take 3 days and require Buddhist monks from Luang Prabang and shamans from the hill tribes. But the French would never do that, she said, because the French did not believe in such things, and by the time they learned to believe, it would be too late. The patrol returned to French lines at 0647 hours, taking fire from Viet Minh positions, but suffering no casualties. Murat delivered the materials to Major Bigard and reported the conversation with the village elder. Bigard listened, thanked him, and said he would distribute the salt and prayers to the units that requested them. But both men knew it wouldn't be enough. The protections might help individuals, might buy them another day or another week, but they wouldn't stop what was happening on a larger scale. That night, the crying intensified. It was no longer confined to isolated sections of trench or specific strong points. It filled the valley, a wall of sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, so loud that men couldn't hear orders being shouted from 5 meters away. The temperature dropped across the entire perimeter, not just in isolated pockets, but everywhere simultaneously. Frost formed on sandbags, on ammunition crates, on the barrels of artillery pieces. The medics in the hospital bunker watched their breath fog and tried to keep the wounded from going into hypothermic shock while surrounded by patients who were already dying from exposure to an enemy that had no material form. The Viet Minh launched their assault on Strongpoint Alien at 2200 hours. It was the beginning of the final phase of the battle, a massive infantry attack supported by artillery and coordinated to overwhelm the remaining defenders. But as the Viet Minh soldiers advanced across no man's land, they encountered the same phenomenon the French had been experiencing for weeks: the crying, the cold, and the figures that appeared in the smoke and darkness wearing old uniforms, standing motionless as bullets passed through them. The Viet Minh attack faltered. Units that had been advancing with discipline and coordination broke apart, soldiers fleeing back toward their own lines, officers screaming orders that no one followed. Radio intercepts captured by French intelligence recorded Viet Minh commanders demanding to know why their men were retreating, and the responses were garbled, panicked, describing entities that moved through their ranks without being touched, that left men frozen where they stood, that made sounds no human could make. For 6 hours, both armies were paralyzed. The French couldn't advance because they had no reserves, no strength left for offensive operations. The Viet Minh couldn't advance because their soldiers refused to enter the killing ground where the crying soldiers walked. The valley became a no man's land in the truest sense, a place claimed by neither the living nor entirely by the dead, but by something in between. At 0400 hours on March 30th, Lieutenant Murat volunteered to lead another patrol, this time not to gather supplies, but to find answers. He took 5 men, all of them veterans who had survived multiple encounters with the crying soldier, and they moved into the center of no man's land to a location that had been identified by Private Nguyen as significant. The site of an old French cemetery from the colonial period, a place where soldiers had been buried in the 1890s during earlier wars in Indochina. The cemetery had been destroyed by artillery, the graves opened, the remains scattered across the churned earth. They found the crying soldier there, not one, but dozens of them, standing among the open graves, all facing inward toward a central point where something else was forming. It was larger than the others, more solid, and it pulsed with a light that was not light, but something darker, something that absorbed rather than reflected. Murat understood in that moment what the village elder had meant. The individual spirits were coalescing, merging into a single entity that would be unstoppable, that would consume everything in the valley and then spread beyond it, following the armies when they left, following them home. He ordered the patrol to withdraw, but before they could move, the central figure turned toward them. And this time, there was no looking away, because it filled their entire field of vision, because it existed not just in physical space, but in perception itself. They saw its face, or the absence of its face, and they understood that what they were seeing was not a ghost or a spirit, but something older, something that had been waiting beneath the valley for centuries, waiting for enough death to give it form, waiting for the rituals to be abandoned and the boundaries to fail. Private Nguyen screamed something in Vietnamese, a prayer or a curse, and threw the last of the salt toward the entity. The salt burned where it touched the darkness, brief flashes of white light, but it wasn't enough. The entity moved toward them, not walking but flowing, and the temperature dropped so suddenly that the moisture in the air crystallized, falling as snow in a tropical valley where snow had never fallen before. Corporal Petit grabbed Murat and dragged him backward, and the patrol ran, not in formation, but in blind panic, stumbling through the darkness, falling and rising and running again. Behind them, the crying reached a crescendo, a sound so intense that it became physical pain, and 3 of the 5 men collapsed, blood running from their ears, their nervous systems unable to process the sensory input. Murat and Petit made it back to French lines at 05:23 hours. The other 3 did not. And when the sun rose over Dien Bien Phu on March 30th, both sides could see what had formed in the center of the valley, a column of darkness that rose 100 meters into the air, rotating slowly, pulling the fog and smoke into itself like a vortex. It was visible to French observers at the garrison, to Viet Minh commanders on the hills, and to the pilots of reconnaissance aircraft flying overhead, who photographed it and filed reports that would be classified for 50 years. General Giap, viewing the phenomenon through binoculars from his command post, made a decision that would alter the course of the battle. He ordered his troops to pull back from their forward positions, to cease all offensive operations until the phenomenon dissipated. His political officers argued that this was the moment to press the attack, that the French were broken and could be overrun with one final push. But Giap overruled them. He said that what was happening in the valley was beyond politics, beyond tactics, and that no victory was worth what it would cost to fight through that darkness. In the French command bunker, Colonel de Castries received a communication from Hanoi. The garrison was to attempt a breakout. All personnel who could walk were to evacuate the valley, heading south toward Laos, abandoning the wounded and the equipment. It was an admission of defeat, but more than that, it was an acknowledgement that holding Dien Bien Phu was no longer militarily or psychologically possible. The breakout began at 1800 hours on March 30th. 1,200 men, all that remained of the original garrison, moved south in a column that stretched for kilometers, harassed by Viet Minh snipers, but not by the crying soldiers, who remained in the valley, clustered around the central darkness that pulsed like a heart made of shadow. Behind them, in the trenches and bunkers of Dien Bien Phu, the wounded waited. Major Grauwin stayed with them, as did a handful of medics and chaplains who refused to abandon their patients. They listened to the crying grow louder as night fell, felt the cold settle over the valley, and knew that by morning, none of them would be alive. The breakout column reached Laotian territory on April 2nd, 48 hours after departing Dien Bien Phu. Of the 1,200 men who began the march, fewer than 700 arrived. Some had been killed by Viet Minh ambushes during the retreat. Others had simply disappeared during the night, wandering off into the jungle or collapsing by the side of the trail and not rising again. A significant number died from hypothermia despite the tropical heat, their bodies found by follow-on patrols with the same gray skin, the same frost patterns, the same vacant expressions that had become horribly familiar. Lieutenant Murat survived the march. Corporal Petit did not. He was found on the morning of April 1st, sitting against a tree with his weapon across his lap, staring at nothing, dead from no apparent cause. His body temperature, measured within an hour of discovery, was 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Private Nguyen made it to Laos but died 3 days later in a field hospital, his final words recorded by a French chaplain. "They followed us. They are still following." The Viet Minh entered Dien Bien Phu on May 7th, more than a month after the French breakout. They had waited, consolidating their positions, allowing the valley to settle before committing forces to occupy it. What they found was a charnel house. The wounded who had been left behind were all dead, but not from their injuries. They lay in the hospital bunker and in the aid stations, frozen in positions that suggested they had died peacefully, but their faces told a different story. Eyes wide, mouths open in silent screams, expressions of terror that should not have been possible for men who had been sedated with morphine. Major Grauwin's body was found in the surgical bunker, slumped over his operating table, his instruments laid out as if he had been in the middle of a procedure. He had died sometime during the night of March 30th. The autopsy, conducted later by Vietnamese medical personnel, found no cause of death. His heart had simply stopped. He was 41 years old. The Viet Minh soldiers who entered the valley reported experiencing the same phenomena the French had described: unexplained cold zones, auditory hallucinations, visual anomalies. 3 soldiers from the 312th Division died within the first week of occupation, their deaths officially attributed to exhaustion, but privately acknowledged as something else. General Giap issued orders that no personnel were to remain in the valley after dark, that all patrols were to be completed before 1800 hours, and that the old cemetery at the center of the valley was to be avoided entirely. Vietnamese monks were brought in to perform purification rituals. They burned incense, scattered salt, recited sutras for 3 days and 3 nights. The villagers who had fled returned to help, bringing their own shamans who performed ceremonies that predated Buddhism, ceremonies that involved blood and fire, and offerings to spirits whose names were no longer spoken aloud. The rituals helped, but they didn't completely cleanse the valley. The monks reported that the darkness at the center, the vortex that had formed during the final days of the battle, had not entirely dissipated. It had only receded, sinking back into the earth, waiting. The valley was declared off limits for civilian habitation. The French fortifications were demolished, the trenches filled in, and the remaining bodies, those that could be found, were buried in mass graves marked with simple wooden crosses. But the graves didn't stay closed. Within 6 months, locals reported that the earth over the burials had sunken, as if the bodies beneath had been compressed or had simply vanished. When investigators opened one of the graves to check, they found it empty. No remains, no clothing, nothing but cold earth that smelled faintly of ozone. Lieutenant Murat was repatriated to France in June 1954. He was decorated for valor, promoted to captain, and assigned to a training post in southern France, where he would never have to see combat again. He lasted 3 months before he resigned his commission and entered a monastery in the Pyrenees. He spoke to no one about what he had experienced in Indochina, maintaining complete silence on the subject for 2 years, until a visiting military chaplain noticed that Murat was sleeping with all the lights on, that he refused to enter any room where he could not see all 4 corners simultaneously, and that he had developed a pathological fear of silence. The chaplain convinced him to write down what had happened, not for official records but for his own peace of mind, and Murat produced a document that ran to 47 pages. It described in meticulous detail the progression of the haunting, the deaths, the encounter in no man's land, and his belief that the entity they had awakened was still active, still growing, still feeding on the violence that continued across Indochina as the war between the Viet Minh and the French evolved into the war between North Vietnam and the Americans. The document was forwarded to French military intelligence, where it was read by a small team of analysts specializing in psychological warfare and non-conventional threats. They filed it alongside similar reports from Algeria, from Madagascar, from other colonial conflicts where soldiers had reported encounters with phenomena that defied conventional explanation. The pattern was clear to those willing to see it. Certain locations, certain types of violence, certain violations of local burial customs and spiritual protocols created conditions where the boundary between the material and immaterial became permeable. And what came through that boundary was never benign. Murat died in 1957 in his sleep during a winter night when the temperature in his monastery cell was recorded at a comfortable 68 degrees Fahrenheit. His body was found frozen solid, his expression peaceful, his hands folded across his chest as if he had been prepared for burial by someone else. The monks who found him reported that the room had been ice cold when they entered, cold enough that their breath fogged, but within minutes of opening the door, the temperature had returned to normal. He was 29 years old. In Vietnam, the valley of Dien Bien Phu remained empty for decades. The Vietnamese government established a memorial there in the 1980s, a museum and monument to commemorate the victory over French colonialism, but the staff reported persistent problems, equipment failures, unexplained power outages, and a staff turnover rate that was 3 times the national average for similar facilities. Visitors occasionally reported feeling watched, feeling cold in rooms that should have been warm, and hearing sounds that resembled crying, but which maintenance crews could never locate or explain. In 2004, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, a French-Vietnamese reconciliation ceremony was held at the site. Veterans from both sides attended. Old men now, the enmity between them softened by time, but not entirely gone. During the ceremony, as speeches were being given and wreaths were being laid, the temperature dropped 20 degrees in less than a minute. The microphones picked up interference, a low-frequency hum that resolved into something that sounded almost like weeping. The ceremony was cut short and the attendees were evacuated to their buses earlier than planned. One of the French veterans, a man who had been a private in the Foreign Legion during the siege, approached the Vietnamese organizers afterward and asked if they had experienced any unusual phenomena at the site over the years. The organizers, after some hesitation, admitted that they had, and that local people avoided the valley after dark, that there were stories about soldiers who appeared in the fog, and that sometimes, on quiet nights, you could hear crying from the place where the old cemetery had been. The veteran nodded and said he had expected as much. He said that what had been awakened at Dien Bien Phu had never been put to rest, that it couldn't be put to rest as long as people remembered the battle, as long as the violence was commemorated and retold. He said the crying soldier was not a ghost in the traditional sense, but a scar on reality itself, a permanent mark left by the magnitude of suffering that had occurred there. And scars, he said, never fully healed. They only faded. The memorial remains open, but staff are no longer required to work overnight shifts. The buildings are locked at sunset, and the grounds are not patrolled after dark. Local security cameras, installed to prevent vandalism, frequently malfunction, their footage showing static and interference during the hours between midnight and dawn. When the footage is reviewed, occasionally there are images that don't quite make sense. Shapes that move through the frame without casting shadows, cold spots visible as distortions in the infrared spectrum. And in one instance, a figure standing near the old cemetery site, motionless, facing away from the camera, visible for 17 seconds before the feed cuts to static. The French government declassified portions of the Dien Bien Phu after action reports in 2014, 60 years after the battle. Most of the documents dealt with tactical analysis, forced dispositions, and political ramifications. But buried in the appendices was a brief notation about unexplained casualties, about deaths from environmental exposure that could not be reconciled with meteorological data, and about reports from multiple personnel of auditory and visual phenomena that suggested either mass hallucination or something else. The notation concluded with a recommendation that had never been implemented: further study into the psychological effects of prolonged siege warfare and the potential for environmental factors to create sensory distortions that could be mistaken for supernatural events. It was a bureaucratic explanation for something that bureaucracy could not contain, and those who had been there, those who had survived and carried the memory of what they had seen, knew that the explanation was inadequate, that the truth was larger and darker and more terrible than any official record would ever acknowledge. In the village north of Dien Bien Phu, the village where Lieutenant Murat's patrol had found the temple supplies, the elders still tell the story. They speak of the crying soldier not as legend, but as fact, as a warning that certain places should not be disturbed, that certain boundaries should not be crossed. They teach their children to leave offerings at the edge of the valley: salt, rice, flowers, not to honor the dead, but to keep them satisfied, to keep them from wandering. And on certain nights, when the fog rolls down from the mountains and settles over the valley floor, they close their doors and windows, light incense, and wait for morning. Because the crying soldier still walks. He walks in the place where he died, and in the places where those who saw him carried his memory. He is patient. He is eternal. And he is waiting for the next war, the next violation, the next moment when the living forget that the dead demand respect. The French military's official history of the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, published in 1967, runs to 843 pages. It includes detailed tactical analysis, biographical sketches of key commanders, maps showing the progression of the siege, and appendices covering everything from ammunition expenditure to casualty statistics broken down by unit and nationality. What it does not include anywhere in those 843 pages is any mention of unexplained deaths, supernatural phenomena, or the events that Lieutenant Murat documented in his 47-page manuscript. The manuscript itself was classified Confidentiel Défense in 1957 and transferred to the Service Historique de la Défense, the French military archives, where it was filed in a section designated for sensitive materials requiring specialist evaluation before potential declassification. It remained there, unread by anyone without specific authorization, for 37 years. In 1994, a military historian named Dr. Claire Beaumont requested access to the file as part of her research into combat stress reactions during the Indochina War. Her request was denied without explanation. She persisted, filing appeals through academic and official channels, and eventually received a one-paragraph response stating that the material in question contained unsubstantiated claims of a nature that could harm the reputation of the French armed forces and serve no legitimate historical purpose. Dr. Beaumont was persistent. She contacted veterans of Dien Bien Phu, conducting interviews with the few who were still alive and willing to speak. She found patterns. 6 separate veterans, interviewed independently, described the same phenomena: the crying, the cold, the figures in antique uniforms, the deaths that could not be explained. One of them, a former sergeant named Émile Garnier, told her that he had filed an official report about what he had witnessed, but the report had been removed from his service record, and he had been told by his commanding officer that if he spoke about it publicly, he would be charged with conduct unbecoming and stripped of his pension. When Dr. Beaumont attempted to publish her findings in a peer-reviewed military history journal, the article was rejected. The reviewers stated that while her research into combat stress was valuable, the sections dealing with alleged paranormal events were not supported by documentary evidence and detracted from the credibility of her work. She revised the article, removing all references to the supernatural, but the pattern was there even in the sanitized version. An unusually high number of deaths from hypothermia in a tropical environment, multiple cases of sudden cardiac arrest among young men with no prior health issues, and testimony from dozens of soldiers describing identical auditory and visual experiences. The revised article was published in 1997, buried in an academic journal with limited circulation. It attracted little attention, except from one reader, a lieutenant colonel in the French Foreign Intelligence Service named Jacques Moreau, who had been tasked with reviewing historical conflicts for lessons applicable to modern asymmetric warfare. Moreau read Dr. Beaumont's article, recognized what she was describing, and requested access to the original classified materials. His request was approved, and he spent 3 weeks in the archives reading not just Lieutenant Murat's manuscript, but similar reports from other colonial conflicts. What he found was a library of the impossible. Reports from the Algerian War describing entire patrol bases where soldiers had died overnight from exposure despite temperatures that never dropped below 70 degrees. Reports from Madagascar documenting a series of deaths among French troops stationed near burial grounds that had been disturbed during road construction. Reports from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos describing phenomena identical to what had occurred at Dien Bien Phu: the crying, the cold, the figures that appeared and disappeared, and the deaths that followed. Colonel Moreau compiled his findings into a classified briefing titled Non-Conventional Threat Assessment: Cultural and Spiritual Factors in Counterinsurgency Operations. He presented it to a small group of senior officers and intelligence analysts in 1998, arguing that the French military needed to develop protocols for operating in environments where local spiritual beliefs were not merely cultural curiosities, but represented real operational hazards. His presentation was met with polite skepticism. One general asked if Moreau was seriously suggesting that ghosts were a threat to military operations. Moreau responded that he was suggesting that there were phenomena science did not adequately explain, and that dismissing them as superstition had gotten French soldiers killed in the past and would likely do so again in the future. His recommendations were filed away. The briefing was classified, and Moreau was transferred to a different posting. But his work had consequences. It was read by analysts in other nations who had access to French intelligence sharing networks, and it sparked a quiet conversation that spanned multiple militaries and intelligence services. The Americans had similar reports from Vietnam. The British had them from Burma and Malaya. The Soviets, after the fall of the USSR, released documents showing that Red Army units in Afghanistan had encountered phenomena that matched the pattern: unexplained cold, auditory hallucinations, and deaths from hypothermia in desert environments. The pattern suggested something that modern military doctrine was not equipped to address: that certain places, after sufficient violence and death, became what one anthropologist called spiritually contested terrain, locations where the normal rules of physical reality were compromised by the accumulated trauma of mass death. The crying soldier of Dien Bien Phu was not unique. He was one manifestation of a phenomenon that appeared across cultures, across continents, in any place where the dead outnumbered the living, and where the rituals meant to ease the transition from life to death had been abandoned. In 2008, a joint NATO study group on unconventional threats in urban combat environments included a classified annex addressing cultural sensitivities related to burial practices and spiritual beliefs in theater. The language was carefully neutral, bureaucratic, designed to avoid any explicit acknowledgement of supernatural phenomena. But the recommendations were clear: avoid establishing bases near historical burial sites, respect local customs regarding the treatment of enemy dead, and ensure that cultural advisors were integrated into planning processes to identify potential non-kinetic threats. The annex was based in part on data collected from French operations in Dien Bien Phu, American operations in Vietnam, and Soviet operations in Afghanistan. It noted that casualties from unexplained environmental exposure were statistically significant in all three conflicts, that these casualties clustered in specific geographic areas associated with historical violence or disturbed burial grounds, and that soldiers who survived exposure to these areas reported psychological trauma that did not respond to conventional treatment. The study was never made public. Portions of it were shared with special operations forces and intelligence units deploying to Iraq and Afghanistan, but the language was so hedged, so careful to avoid sounding unscientific, that most readers dismissed it as academic overcaution. Those who had experienced similar phenomena themselves, who had been in Fallujah or Helmand or Kandahar and felt the cold and heard the sounds and seen the shapes that shouldn't exist, recognized what the study was really saying, but they didn't talk about it because talking about it meant risking their careers, their credibility, and their mental health evaluations. The unofficial network grew slowly. Veterans from different nations, different conflicts, different decades, connecting through private channels and encrypted communications, sharing stories that would never appear in official records. They developed their own protocols, their own methods for operating in spiritually contested terrain. Salt carried in pockets, prayers learned from local interpreters, rules like never looking directly at unexplained figures, never sleeping in buildings where mass casualties had occurred, never disturbing burial sites without permission from local religious authorities. These protocols worked in the sense that men who followed them tended to survive longer than those who didn't. But they couldn't eliminate the threat entirely because the threat was embedded in the nature of war itself, in the violence, the death, the violation of the boundaries between the living and the dead that occurred whenever armies clashed. The crying soldier of Dien Bien Phu was a warning, but it was a warning that no modern military could afford to heed without fundamentally changing how war was conducted. In Vietnam, the government has quietly acknowledged that certain areas remain off-limits, not for unexploded ordnance or environmental contamination, but for reasons that are never officially articulated. Dien Bien Phu is one of these areas. The memorial is open during daylight hours, but the valley itself, the actual battlefield, is restricted. Official explanations cite preservation of historical sites and respect for the dead. Unofficial explanations, shared by local officials when they think no one from Hanoi is listening, are more direct. The valley is haunted, the dead have not left, and anyone who spends time there after dark will not leave unchanged. The Thai and Hmong villagers know this. They have known it for generations, long before the French arrived, long before the Viet Minh, long before the valley became a graveyard for empires. They say that the land remembers, that blood soaks into the earth and changes it, and that places where many have died violently become thin places, where the membrane between worlds is permeable. The crying soldier is one name for what emerges from these thin places. There are others. Every culture has them, and every culture has rituals designed to keep them contained, to prevent them from spreading beyond the boundaries of the battlefields where they were born. But those rituals require acknowledgement, require belief, and modern militaries are institutions built on materialism, on the premise that the world operates according to physical laws that can be measured and controlled. To acknowledge the crying soldier would require acknowledging that there are forces beyond technology, beyond firepower, beyond the rational framework that makes modern warfare possible. And so the acknowledgement never comes. The reports are filed and classified. The veterans are told they suffered from combat stress. And the phenomena continue. In every conflict, in every place where the rules of burial are violated and the dead are denied rest. Lieutenant Murat understood this. In the final pages of his manuscript, he wrote that the crying soldier was not an enemy that could be defeated because it was not truly separate from those who fought. It was a mirror reflecting back the cost of violence, the price of war measured not in territory or political objectives, but in souls. He wrote that every soldier who died at Dien Bien Phu contributed to the entity that hunted them, that they were quite literally creating the thing that killed them, and that the only way to stop it would be to stop fighting altogether. But wars don't stop. They change names, change locations, change justifications, but they don't stop. And so the crying soldier continues. He walks in Dien Bien Phu, and he walks in Mogadishu, and he walks in Fallujah and Aleppo and Mariupol, and every other place where the earth has drunk its fill of blood, and the dead outnumber those who remember them. He is patient. He is inevitable. And he is waiting for us, all of us, because we are all complicit in the violence that feeds him, and we will all, eventually, hear him crying in the darkness. The archives remain closed. The reports remain classified. And in the valley of Dien Bien Phu, on nights when the fog rolls down from the mountains and settles over the ground where thousands died, you can still hear it. Not crying now, but breathing. The slow, steady breath of something that was born from death and waits for death to give it strength again.